Um, this session, we're excited to be running this as part of the Small International Development Charities Programme. So we've got this event today, and then we've got a session on anti-racist practices coming up on the 8th of December. So that'll be a great one to attend if you can make it. And then we've also got a wrap-up event on the 14th. And we've got a couple of e-learning topics, which are sort of access anytime learning for international development charities. We've got on-demand recordings, which you can access anytime. There's also bursaries. Do make the use of those in 2022 while you still can, because we are coming to the end of the UK aid-funded programme that we've had. And there's also a peer support match option, which is a nice little addition to the programme where we sort of match peers in the sector, and they're able to just check in with each other informally and do a bit of networking. So there'll be a little poll at the end inviting you to opt into that if you're interested. Great, so just a bit of housekeeping here. Do network in the chat. If there's someone who seems to have a similar area of work, we invite you to introduce yourself shortly. So do feel free to do a bit of networking there. Slides will be sent out after the webinar. And just a little FYI, there might have been a live streaming notification that you might have seen. This is not meaning anyone's watching us live. It's just the automatic subtitling software that we have enables kind of speaking to itself. So that's what that is. There'll be a little poll at the end of the session, just checking how it was. And that's about it on the housekeeping. Do participate, keep this as a safe space. As I mentioned, do network if you're up for it. Be courteous to your fellow participants. And there's some few just behavioural bits and bobs there. Please be concise and so on, and keep yourself on mute if you're not talking. If you have questions, do feel free to sort of use the raise hand button or unmute if there's a little space for questions. And it should be a great session. Do introduce yourself in the chat. Perhaps people are just sort of finishing off some lunchtime things and they'll be joining us, because there's quite a few more people we were expecting. So hopefully we'll have some late comers, but do introduce yourself in the chat, the people we have got. And I hope it's a great session, and the recording will be available if we don't get all those other attendees that we were expecting live. But I will hand over now to Georgina and Christopher to get us started.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Remy. I'll hand us over to Georgina first, and then I will take over. Over to you, Georgina.
Hi, so my name's Georgina, and I am calling and speaking to you today from Tanga, Tanzania, where I live. And I have been based here for the last 9 years, working for a charity called Pamoja Leo. And I'm really excited to meet everyone today, and yeah, excited to share learning and learn from others as well. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Georgina. And again, thank you to Remy and yourself for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I am calling from a basement in London, but I'm usually based in Kampala, Uganda, and travel around Uganda, where our project is based. The organization I'm representing today is called Child's Eye Foundation. We have been around for about 15 years, and our work is to demonstrate alternatives to institutional care. And we've developed a roadmap, which I will talk about in the first few slides of my presentation. So to get us started, or just before we get started, before we move on to the next slide, I want to just echo what Remy said. This is a safe space. We're mostly here to share learning, but we also want to learn from you. Georgina and I, in preparing for this, recognize that most of you here will probably recognize what we're talking about. So we're sharing what we've done, but we come to you to recognize what you've done too. So at the end, we won't ask lots of questions, and we won't expect you to ask questions, but we want to hear and learn from you too. So next slide. Okay, so I'll just start by setting the scene with the Sustainable Development Goals. Before the pandemic, we weren't really on target to meet these goals. But together, we have a lot of work to do before 2030. For us at Child's Eye, we've set our next strategy to be a 7-year strategy to meet that goal. But the reason I wanted this slide displayed is because the Sustainable Development Goals recognize family as a very important structure for us to support when we are providing intervention. They recognize the essential role that family plays in achieving our aims. And there's a call from the SDGs for a greater understanding and disaggregation of data related to disability and other factors. So we can see already that the SDGs recognize the diversity that families bring. And that's the type of conversation we'll be having today as well. But I wanted you to have this slide so that you have an understanding of our basis and why we do this work. Next slide. So let's get into it. Prioritizing families and communities. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child speaks very clearly about the child for full harmonious development of his or her personality should grow up in a family environment, in an atmosphere of happiness, love, and understanding. We believe that only families can provide the love, sense, and belonging. They give the identity that children need to grow up. Families give children the space to play, learn, and form trusting relationships to feel a part of a wider community. Family in the African context extends to kinship or to kin, an auntie, an uncle, a grandparent, which is why, for example, us in Uganda, you will find that many children are raised by relatives and not necessarily by a biological parent. Because of that diversity, family is a lot wider and needs to be considered. From our experience and our work, strong communities can prevent family breakdown. Communities that are responsive. We saw this during the COVID-19 breakdown with the 700 community champions and volunteers or friends of families that we had trained, who were the first response and the people right there when families needed them. We have to ensure all children belong and are part of a family. And so we always challenge the word often. I've often said to folks that when I worked in the UK, it is very rare, if any at all, we had a case file that said, this orphan child, or Christopher, the orphan. These are words we no longer use. So why do we use them in the context of our work with children that are at risk? The word orphanage itself is a misnomer because we know, and as well from our research, that 4 out of 5 children in an orphanage have a living parent, a mother or a father, and often, as I've explained in the African context, kin or kinship, a grandmother, an auntie, an uncle that they can go back to. So we want to really ask that we use the right language when we talk about children at risk or children that are most likely to be left behind. We leave children behind when we call them orphans, which is not in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide. The next slide and the slide after that will just give you a summary of the context of our work before I hand over to Georgina. We're really trying to break the cycle. Around the world, 5.4 million children, according to the Lancet report in 2020, are growing up in orphanages or in institutions or villages. But there's lack of variable data. In fact, these children are not often counted. There isn't a census. We don't have a really good understanding. So one of the things we call on governments to do is think about how many children are growing up in institutional care. But compounding the issue as well is COVID-19. We have seen in Uganda an increase of the cost of living. This has impacted families and caused them to be in more difficult situations, needing to give their children up. We want to strengthen these families, respond to these situations, keep them stronger, and prevent family breakdown. We also know that over 80 years of evidence has shown that institutions and orphanages can be damaging and unnecessary. They're also a very poor investment. With the organizations and the orphanages we've partnered with, we found that there is a reduction of cost after children have left the institution. I must say there is an increase of cost to remove those children, but there's a reduction of cost. So where we're spending $100 to keep a child in an institution and support them in there, with the overhead costs and so on and so forth, we find that in a family, that is not the cost, even with education included. Now, here are some really important but really heartening facts about what happens when children leave institutional care. And we have seen this evidence with some of the young adults that we've supported to transition out of institutional care. Young adults that spent most of their lives since they were 3 months, 9 years, till they were 21 years of age in institutional care. First and foremost, a child loses a month of their physical and cognitive development. And after 6 months, many of these children are at risk of not recovering that. But even more impactful in the long term, 1 in 3 are likely to become homeless. 1 in 5 are likely to have a criminal record. 1 in 7 become involved in sex work, and 1 in 10. And for us during the pandemic, we've seen this increase to 5 in 10. Half of that are likely to commit suicide or even want to take their own lives. Next slide. So to address this, we're strengthening families and communities. We're giving the power back to where it should belong. We have ideas, but the solutions are already with communities. So we listen to communities so that we can strengthen them, so that families can stay together. We reunite children with their parents, and we find loving Ugandan local parents, community foster parents or community parents, and adoptive parents for those children who cannot go back to their biological families. In doing this, and from the evidence, we're developing a roadmap for sustainable alternatives to orphanages. Sustainable because they're within the community. Truly social services run by those people closest to those families. We're also advocating with parents, with people with lived experience, for change and increased awareness about some of the harmful effects of institutions on children's lives. Even those that are guided by the best interests can never replace the benefits of a loving and nurturing family environment. Now, we are proud that our work has already resulted in reforms for child protection legislation and policy that puts children and families first and brings us a step closer to Uganda with no orphanages. But we know we still have a long way to go. So one of those policies is the National Child Policy, a policy that advocates for children to remain in families, for communities to be listened to and strengthened. We still have orphanages as a last resort, but that doesn't mean that we cannot prevent children from leaving or being separated from their families. And finally, our ambition is not only to change the way children are cared for in Uganda. We want to work with others like yourselves to spearhead a global movement for reform. We are one of the founders of an organization called Transform Alliance Africa, a small alliance of 18 organizations across 11 countries in Africa, who are all committed to this cause. And together with our friends and partners across the world, we believe we can achieve the change that will eventually consign orphanages to the history books. We want to do this by showcasing what works, not by telling you what works, by demonstrating and sharing evidence, not just evidence in Uganda or Africa, but evidence across the world, with partners in Asia, Latin America, and other areas, with partners in Europe like Romania, Bulgaria, who themselves have transitioned from this form of childcare. So with that, and I'll be back, I'm going to hand over to Georgina. Thank you.
Next slide, please, Remy. Thank you so much for that, Chris. So I think all of us here today run small charities in the UK working internationally. And Chris has given us an amazing context to the issues at hand and also the possibilities and opportunities to address some of these issues. And I wanted to just start by addressing some of the context from the perspective of the UK government, seeing as that we're all British charities here. There's the evidence has been building over a number of years towards, you know, that there is better ways that we could be exploring to care for children. And since around 2017, the UK government has made a series of statements and commitments, both to transitioning away from institutional forms of care and also to a commitment to supporting family-based care. So we can see that in 2019 when UK Aid made a commitment to no longer fund institutional care. And this was a shift, this was a real shift in funding and a clear, I think, statement and message from the UK government around what their priorities are based off of the evidence. And it was a commitment to joining this movement towards alternative forms of care. Penny Mordaunt as well made a statement committing towards the long-term process of deinstitutionalization. I love the word long-term process. You know, this isn't an overnight thing, and I think the recognition that this isn't an overnight thing, but that there is a clear commitment from the UK government to be supportive of services for all children that promote family and community-based care. And this shift in the UK, we can also see it in the modern day slavery reports from the UK that mentioned specific issues around orphanage trafficking. And so looking again at different contributing issues. And we can also see countries like Australia and the Netherlands who've gone one step further, and not just, you know, with statements and commitments against funding, but have also created laws and policies around what their citizens, their small charities can do in terms of engagement with orphanages overseas. So really, you know, the evidence is there. There's also now a building political will. Next slide, if you would, Remy. And that will is also reflected, which I think is relevant for UK charities. A huge milestone was in the UN General Assembly in 2019, where a resolution was passed. And this was the first time I think there was a real collective statement made, a global statement where all UN members said that they were prioritizing a focus on children without parental care. And it contains specific articles, number one, recognizing the harms caused by institutionalization. And the second core thing was prioritizing prevention and endorsing family and community-based care over institutions. And this urge to take action, I think, is a really great area which UK small charities can look to support them in seeing the need and being part of addressing this global commitment worldwide. More recently, just actually earlier this year in Kigali, we also had the Commonwealth Declaration, and it strongly echoed what was said in the UNGA resolution, and where all Commonwealth members made a commitment to progressively replace institutions. And this again shows us just how much, especially in recent years, that this global movement has really started to build steam, I guess you could say, and a much wider commitment. Next slide, please. But why is it still worth talking about? It kind of sounds like there's great evidence for it, a lot of political will, but the truth is there's still a long way to go, because despite this, there is still an estimated 5.4 million children, of which the majority of those do have known living parents. Countries like Tanzania, where I work, have seen a doubling in the number of children living in orphanage care in the last 10 years. And they're not the only country where that is the case. So despite the evidence, despite the political will, we are still seeing that these are a group of children that are often forgotten. And I would also echo something that Chris mentioned earlier, that they are also a group of children that are often forgotten in our programming. They're often forgotten in our data collection. And so whilst there's been a lot of focus in housing these children, there's not been a great focus on hearing them, listening to them, and addressing their unique needs. And that's where I think small charities can come in, because there is the will to do so, but there is also now a call of what can we all do about it. And what I haven't been able to see exactly which each organisation's work is involved in, but one of my hopes and my goals of speaking today was to make connections to charities working in a variety of sectors, whether it's health. I saw someone working in health and education earlier, that actually children in institutional care, children at risk of going into institutional care, are also your clients. They're also children to consider and to think about. And that charities working in a variety of sectors, if we can just start to think about those children, think about those families in the work that we do, and create specific ways to strengthen families, involve those children as part of the children that we specifically target, in a way of how can what we do with our access to health services, education, how can that be used to bring children home? And so today we're going to talk and explore a little bit more about what as small charities are areas of work that we could specifically contribute to. And so we're going to look a little bit in programming, the designing and implementing of programs that improve access to services, that improve children's access to high quality alternative family-based care, but also improve access to services that families can access and communities can access, and also the case for investment in child protection systems. I also hope that as organisations we can shift our language and our lens. Chris made a great sort of leaping point towards that as UK charities working internationally, we need to be careful with how we define what family is, in allowing communities and cultures around the world to define and redefine, the breadth of what we see as a family. Being mindful of the use of the words like orphan and orphanages, and ensuring that all our program, if we're supporting and working with children, that we don't forget those children that are often outside of their communities and maybe within orphanages. Because what we've seen happen is children in orphanages are often seen in isolation. And it's because of the language used around the child. An orphan implies a child with no one. And what we know is these children have someone. And so when we're thinking of our programming, hopefully today, if I can make the point that we consider that these are just children, often children with a family or with the same wish, desire, and right to a family. And that often what's getting in the way to accessing their right to a family is services, lack of support. And so when small charities remember children in institutions as part of their clientele, it ensures that those children are not further forgotten, that they're not further isolated, and that services, to target access to education, access to health services, include those children. And we can do that by shifting our lens and focus. Number 3 is that becoming a family-friendly organisation, and I'm quite passionate about this one specifically. How many of us work for small charities out there trying to promote the rights of children, and sometimes we forget to live it in our everyday lives? And I'm quite passionate about how we live it. And so this one maybe is, I'm going to add some slides later, but something we can even discuss with our boards. Does our organisation support things like adoption and foster care leave? Do we have policies in place organisationally with our partner organisations overseas that also ensure that our organisations live out the values of being a family-friendly, family-focused organisation? And we can do this in simple changes to the way that we have our hiring policies. Not all countries around the world recognise adoption leave or recognise fostering leave or kinship care provisions. But as small charities, this is a great way that we can organisationally embody the values and principles of family-based care. The fourth thing is around think family, think community. And I'm quite passionate about these two specific areas because for a long time, orphan care has been, well, the sector has been kind of deemed orphan care. And what it did when we considered orphan care in isolation is it prevented us from thinking family and thinking community, which made the response very much around providing to the basic needs of the orphan. And that's why we often saw this, real surge in institutional care and thinking, because it was meeting a need. But when we considered to reimagine what it could look like, it comes with the reimagining of the problem. And that is to start to include the different spaces which children exist within. And then I think the fifth thing that I hope that we can all take away from today is the power and importance of learning together, sharing our work, and networking with one another. Next slide, please, Remy. So I don't know how many people here today are representatives from their organisational boards, but here's just a few on the sort of topic of practical actions that we can take. Sometimes our immediate thinking is to go straight into programming. What programs can we do? How can we change the way we program or advocate? But I think it's equally important to discuss the ways as organisations are safeguarding our approaches to work can influence the outcomes. So as I mentioned before, things like considering how our organisation promotes and creates space and policies for things like adoption leave and flexibility for foster and kinship caregivers. Also, another thing to look at is when we're looking at our safeguarding and our child protection, does it include a policy on trafficking? Does it specifically include a policy on orphanage trafficking? There is a specific issue where many children have been recruited into institutions. And as small charities working internationally, often without meaning to and unintentionally, we have fueled this. And so looking at the way that our safeguarding and our child protection policies can be designed as such that we ensure that we as organisations are preventing family breakdown by ensuring that we have appropriate safeguarding and child protection mechanisms that prevent things specifically like orphanage trafficking can be a really great way to start to embody the values of moving towards a world where more children have access to family care. Just at the end of this seminar, I will be sending out an email that Chris and I have compiled together a list of various statements and some of the statements that we've already mentioned before. And it's really important as our boards and organisations that we remain aware of what these agendas are. And so I'll be sending out a document which just provides links to some of these UN statements and statements by various governments, because it helps us to ensure that we're keeping up to date and aligned with what is going on around family-based care. And then finally, just ensuring that the way that we operate and work, it is preventative and it is prioritising families. And so oftentimes our programming, when we only allow access to services after separation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that further down, how our own organisation saw a very unique need in our community, where the only access to free formula milk in our community for families who have infants, maybe their mother had died, maybe for some reason the mother wasn't breastfeeding, the only access to free formula milk was in the orphanage. So accessing the resource of milk was conditional on relinquishing your child. And so what we saw was unintentionally, organisations were providing a service and a resource, but the conditionality on accessing that resource was relinquishment. So one of our core programs had been to provide now free formula care milk to families in the family, and it completely stopped children entering the orphanage. And so what we can see is in the way that we program, sometimes unintentionally, our programming can incentivize separation. And so reviewing these different areas, and I know people will have all different unique ones, but that's one that's very relevant to our own work, was that sometimes the best intentioned project was actually incentivizing the separation of children from their family. Next slide, please. So hopefully these previous slides have created a case that I think there is a really good case for UK charities to be part of changing the way we care. There's an excellent case that there is a need for more investment in system strengthening of child protection systems across the globe, for investment in human resources such as social workers, and as Chris said, investment into the human capital, the ability for communities to be able to respond effectively. There's a real need for services that strengthen families and investment in alternative family-based care such as fostering and local adoption. So there is a real need for organizations to get behind investment into these areas. And in the next slide, I think we're going to be looking at some examples of that, starting with Chris, and he's going to take us through what that looked like for Child's Eye in Uganda.
Thank you, Georgina. So folks, it's easy to talk about the change we want to see. It's harder to put it in practice. And it hasn't taken us, as Georgina said, a day or a year or even 3 years. It took some careful planning and a lot of mistakes. It also took some difficult learning. So I'm going to start by telling you about our story. We were established as an orphanage. Our founder wanted to see children saved from abandonment, from harm, from violence. She wanted to see them with a family in an orphanage home. But very quickly, the social workers that she worked with told her and demonstrated that most of those children could go home, could be reunified, could be reintegrated, could be brought together with a new family member, a kin member, or with an adoption or adoptive Ugandan family. So we thought very hard, and after seeing that it was possible, we reduced our 25-bed home to an 8-bed home. But what was really interesting for us is it still cost us so much money. So figure this, you have an 8-bed home with 2 children in it, but you still have to pay the electricity, you still have to pay for the staff, you still have to pay for the water bills, you still have to pay for everything. And we realized that if we supported those children to go home, that we would still be able to spend a lot less for those children and their families. But the other thing we also recognized very quickly was that these children in the orphanage weren't doing as well with their developmental milestones as the children in families. In fact, after we moved from a 25 to an 8-bed home, our initial transition was to take some of the caregivers or the carers in that home to become foster families, community parents. So we didn't let them go. We kept them and trained them as foster parents. And it was still cheaper. But most importantly, the outcomes were better for those children, particularly for children with special needs, children with disabilities, children that were HIV positive, that were unwanted in their communities. These children were doing better. In our second transition, we learned a lot more. This is documented quite well with support from Better Care Network. And as Georgina said, we'll send that out to you. And you will read very carefully about some of the lessons we learned in transition. First of all, make sure you leave no one behind. We left some people behind. There were some challenges with how we did foster care. And we really learned very quickly that we had to change that. So our model of foster care, initially paid, became a community approach. So we had to let some of our paid foster carers go and find community foster carers in some of those communities we were supporting. More of that is in the document, so I won't go into that detail. As you can see here, despite measures put in place to try to ensure that the residential care was used sparingly and temporarily, we began to notice that as soon as one child was reintegrated, another would come right in. The beds were always full. Even though the aim was to reintegrate children within a 3-month period to avoid developmental regression, many children ended up staying for as long as for longer than 3 months, and some even for as long as 3 years. In some cases, reunification or adoption processes took 1 to 2 years to complete. Now, this is pretty important because what we were missing was the prevention element. We weren't recognizing that children didn't need to come into this. We were simply opening our doors and taking them in. We were open for children to come in, instead of thinking, as Georgina said, about the services in the community. So using the 3 phases of transition, which you will read about, the learning all the way to the transition, we closed our home and moved from residential to community-based care. And we did this. 1, we strengthened our prevention approach. And very quickly, from supporting about 6 to 60 children a year, we were looking at 400 to thousands of children a year. How did we do that? When you train the community and support them to look out for children, to support and refer children, there'll be many more referrals that need support. Community volunteers are able to identify up to 25 families a month. An individual social worker can identify 1 child in abandonment a month. Some of the results from the work with prevention has been that in some wards in our urban area, Makindye in Kampala, there are no abandonments at all, because people are responding to the prevention to stop people from abandoning their children, to support teenage mothers, to support young women and women experiencing violence as soon as possible. A number of us run educational services, health services. That coordination approach with those services meant that we could identify people in need a lot earlier, so that children were never separated from their families. Families like our own need support. They need a network. I know that personally, as a father, one of my greatest fears, besides being a psychotherapist with so much knowledge in social work, was how I would raise and keep my baby alive. So I relied on my auntie, my mother, my grandmother, my uncles, and my friends. These are the same conversations that families have. So providing parental support, providing income generation and livelihood support, educational support, vocational studies, health, all these services that a number of you are providing prevent children from being separated from their families. What we need to recognize is that we're doing it and that we can submit the data for it. And as Georgina and I have said, to remove that word orphan child and remember that children belong to families and to communities. So folks, we transitioned Malaika babies home. It took us a couple of months to do, and it has taken us 5 years to demonstrate the practice of community-based child protection systems, which moves me on to our next big milestone, which also is documented and we'll share with you. We decided that we wouldn't respond to all the children experiencing abandonment across the country. We would go to one district in eastern Uganda called Tororo. In this district, there were 5 orphanages, but we would pick 2 to partner with, to demonstrate our work. The second one took a while to come on, but the first one worked really quickly and well with us. The founder of that orphanage has told her story to many beyond our reach. She talks about how she heard children say, "The people in here are paid to look after me. It isn't because they care." And she recognized why she needed to support those children to go back to their families. Those 2 orphanages supported us to transition the other 5 who self-transitioned on their own. But a number of children, over 300 children, have moved out of institutional care to family and community-based care in that district. There are 0 orphanages. And within the first year of implementation in 2019, the government put a moratorium in place, asking that no more orphanages be open in that particular district. I'm pleased to let you know that today, there are no orphanages in Tororo district. Political will being the first thing that led the way. We also have 10 community development networks established across the district. And with the experience and the evidence and the practice, a visit from the government, a visit from UNICEF, we were able to influence the National Child Policy, which was signed into effect in June 2020. Tororo has become a model district for deinstitutionalization, visited by Malawi, Kenya, and other governments to learn and see that it is possible. That same district has also been visited by other districts in Uganda so that they can see and learn and make sure that they can see that it's possible for this to happen. But I have to remind us, it isn't overnight when you're building these child protection systems. And most importantly, you cannot do it as organizations on your own. It has to be done with the community. As I summarize this, I want to just speak through 4 aspects of our theory of change so that you can understand why and how this is possible. The first, political will. You don't do this without government, local authority, policy, and the people leading it, even in their community, agreeing to do this. The second one is knowledge and know-how. Within our first couple of years, we had to learn. So we went to Rwanda, where this work is advanced, to learn. We've spent a lot of time training ourselves, but training others in how to do this work. Local government, other NGOs, partners, and our partner institutions, the orphanages that we work with. Capacity. Now, this is important. Capacity is not just about the social work team. It's about the community volunteers who are part of that social work team, the friends of families, the champions of families. In the last 2 years, we've also developed a network of peer educators and peer champions. We call them well-being champions. These are young people with lived experience of care who have left institutions, who can talk very openly about their stories and support others to understand why it's important for mental health and well-being to be a primary aspect of reintegration, reunification, and supporting communities. And the third one is financing. Folks, we wouldn't be social impact organizations if we didn't talk about this. However, to ensure that this work is sustainable, we first have to divert the funding from the donors that are supporting institutions to community-based care. This isn't funding to Child's Eye. This is remodeling, repurposing. Many orphanages that have 30 to 60 children in their institutions can go on to support more, like the orphanages we partnered with. They're now community hubs supporting more children in their communities. So financing is very important. So political will, knowledge and know-how, capacity, and financing. Over to you, Georgina.
Thank you, Chris. I always love hearing your story of transition. It's always so inspiring. So I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about early childhood education provision. And so I want to share the reflections that we have as an organisation. So Pomoduleo predominantly works with children aged 0 to 6. We work in that early childhood period, and most of our programming works to ensure that children get their needs met, they get the care that they need, and that they have a loving, responsive, protective family environment around them. So early childhood development and early childhood education isn't necessarily we're not an education charity. That's what I'm trying to say. We're not an education charity. We're a child protection charity. But I think the lines blur in how, when you're talking about alternative care of children, we have to look at where these lines blur and make sure that different services are speaking to one another, because really children become vulnerable when they don't get access to the services they need. And one of the key things that we learned was how many children before they were entering school were really at risk and vulnerable of being placed in an institution. And when we started speaking to families, the answers they had were quite clear and actually very heartwarming, because the response was the response of a protective and caring individual. Somebody who said, I want to go to work and care for these kids who are in school, but to do so, I can't care for this kid. And so people were making tough choices in very hard and challenging circumstances that were leading to relinquishment. And so providing free early childhood daycare and preschool spaces, what we were able to do is to take families that had this proactive, protective approach to raising their families and provide them a way to keep caring and keep protecting and keep their children together and go out and earn a living. And this was especially important for kinship carers. Many families hadn't planned to suddenly have a family of 7 children. That decision was made overnight when their sister-in-law passed away, and they suddenly saw that there was 3 children that now needed somewhere to go, and they wanted to take them in. But the questions started flowing, well, how am I going to keep working? I have a vegetable stall. Can I take the children with me? Oh, it's not safe. They're on the side of the road. All these questions start coming for families, which means that they're being limited to be able to take on that role that they would like to take. And so providing free early childhood spaces, daycare spaces, we saw so many families able now to say yes to children, to say yes to being a kinship carer, to saying yes to being a wonderful single mother. And even subsequently in 2019, we also went on to train community-based foster carers. And this was one of the big issues that came up as well in that, when people were signing up to take the age ranges of children that they were prepared to care for, we had a real shortage of under 5 caregivers. And one of the reasons and the feedback is that we still need to work because it's a voluntary role. And suddenly with, well, what if you had a free daycare space? Suddenly the hands went, oh, yes, it was purely logistics. And so we can start to see the role and the space for community services and things like early childhood education. And so for anyone, if you're potentially running early childhood education projects, one of the things I wanted to make mention to here is connecting to your local social welfare, your local organizations, making sure the community know, and even to local orphanages or organizations that are supporting reunification, letting them know that there are these spaces available through your programming, building your network. It would be interesting for people to see the different places that if you're providing services, these could also be reunification services, these could also be family strengthening services without people realizing it. And so this was a really huge area of learning for us at how many families can be supported when we look at the mentality, family first, meet the children's needs, and then how do we as a community come together in that provision, maintaining those 2 core structures at the center, family first, meeting the child's needs. We as the charity, as an organization, in partnership with the local government, collectively and collaboratively, we're then able to create a team around raising a child rather than removing the child. And one of the other key elements of this is that the family gets stronger too. When we take children out of a struggling family, the family is left in their struggle. Whereas when we look at more holistic approaches, families get stronger, which means communities get stronger. And so we start to see that the sustainability of our programming and of our investment, when we're putting it into children within their family, the ripple effect of that change is so much greater. Next slide, please. I made reference to this a little bit at the beginning. And this story was really powerful one of learning and reflection for us as an organization. When we started out, one of our first things that we did was we asked for data on who was living in the orphanages in the region and why were they there. The reality was that there wasn't data. And so one of our first tasks as an organization that we went about doing was we asked, in collaboration with the local government authorities, can we find out? And from that, we surveyed every child in the district living in an institution, the caregivers, and we created a profile on each child, a digital profile. The district liked it so much, they then asked us if we could do the region. And so it went off to the entire region. And from that, one of the key findings we found was that the number one reason, and almost the only reason, there was very few outliers to this, that children were coming into the orphanage was it came down to some reason around that the family or the community was searching for milk for that baby for one reason or the other. That baby no longer had access to a lactating mother, and therefore feeding that baby was a challenge. That could be because of maternal death, that may have been because of abandonment, HIV status, not producing milk. So various reasons were denying these infants access to a lactating mother, and therefore feeding the child was important. And as I mentioned before, the only way at that time for a child to get milk, so a family had a crisis, how do I feed this baby? The only option on offer was to relinquish the child to an orphanage to get access to that milk. And Chris mentioned a few times when he was talking, that very same milk was being purchased in the children's home. And so the question we asked ourselves was, well, does that make sense? Because the additional expense in the children's home of then the staff, it's the very same milk being provided. What would happen? What would it look like if that milk was provided directly to families? And so we worked on designing and developing a program that ensured that when families were in need of milk, they had access to the milk, but also access to support and other services to ensure that the families could stay together. And one of the most amazing things that happened when we started bringing women who were often foster mothers, grandmothers whose daughters had died caring for infants, aunties, neighbours, when we started this hub, this space where women would come every week, get the baby weighed, get access to formula training, we started to see women talk. And the power of this community that started to be created when a grandmother with a newborn, terrified about how they were going to raise their child, got to meet another grandma with a 5-month-old, chunky, healthy baby. And they got to go, I'm not alone. There's someone else like me. And the other grandma got to say, I was you just 5 months ago. And they started talking, and what started happening was and it was something that we never could have predicted. And it made us, and it refocused us to realizing it's not just about us as an organization and the programs and seeing them in isolation. What we really needed to do was look outwards, was to look at the community, and was to look at how we can better make sure that we're supporting communities to do what they already do best, which is support each other and build upon that. And so it was a really powerful way of seeing how the unintentional consequences of providing services that bring people together and allow communities to start supporting each other really shifted. Now other families are massive advocates of the program. They're out in the villages finding other families. When the baby's mother dies, they're there. Did you know there's a way? We're here for you. They're champions of keeping children together. When we first started the program, we get a lot of babies, maybe 3 or 4, giving them cow's milk, babies that got quite sickly, and we would often be finding the case and referring them straight to the hospital. That's almost, the statistics around that have dropped dramatically. Why? Because the community started acting faster. Babies got as quickly. So now we get children who, or children when immediately when an issue starts, the community is so responsive to the project, to knowing that there's services, that they're acting, which is improving, the outcome for children. It's reducing incidences of hospitalization due to malnutrition. So the ripple effects of this is just really powerful. And I think the core point I wanted to make here is that when we shift the way we think to being part of a community, to being part of a system, to being part of the services available to children, we get to see the power of child protection in action through local actors. And a lot of people talk to me and they worry about, isn't it more dangerous putting children in families? Isn't it risky if children are going to be living in families? And I just wanted to highlight 2 core points here, is from the data that we know that children in institutional care are at much higher risk of different forms of abuse. So, however, that does not eliminate the risk of community and family-based abuse. However, by investing in these networks, in these community services, in these responsive families and members of the community, what we're able to do is strengthen the community's awareness, understanding, and responsiveness to abuse of children. And so actually what we're seeing is then, like Chris said before, when the doors are just open, children just keep coming, abused children will keep coming through the doors of the institutions. When we start to shift our programming to strengthening systems, families, communities, and child protection systems, what we can start to see is that the system as a whole gets stronger. And when that gets, the protection of children becomes stronger as well. And so, when we consider where we're putting our investments, yes, there's always risk and the need for safeguarding and child protection, and I'm not minimizing that in any way. However, what we can see is when we're investing in responsive community mechanisms, those things can get better. Cases and children can be better protected. And that's what is really important here for me to highlight. When Chris and I, Jerry, next slide if you would. When Chris and I started talking, our goal with sharing with people today was not for this to be just an information exercise. We recognize from myself, I remember when our organisation looked to start a foster care programme, it was only through talking to organisations like Child's Eye and Hope and Homes and other organisations that we were able to ensure that we didn't repeat the mistakes of others and that our work was built upon best practice. And we seek now to share our mistakes and our learning so that the community of practice grows and gets stronger. And so our hope now is up a little bit and to hear from other people. What are you up to? What are you doing? What can we learn together? We're really interested to hear how this work lives in the different organisations involved. So, Chris, if you'd like to help me here in just opening the floor to others.
Thank you, Georgina. And thank you for that piece. So, as Georgina said, and as I said at the start, we recognize that this will be reflection for many, those of you on the call now and those who will watch this afterwards. Please feel free, if you're watching this afterwards, feel free to get in touch with FSI who can share as many questions with us. We're also happy to connect. But if you're on the call now, welcome again. We'd like to open to you to share some of your work. And in that sharing, ask us any questions so that we can see synergy, learning, and thinking. If this topic is new, we also welcome that. There is no question that is not a good question. And it's also a very safe space for us to learn and listen. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris and Georgina. And yes, do pop anything into the chat. I can't see people unmuting quite yet, but do feel free to pipe up. I suppose, I had a bit of a question just around, I suppose, the differences in different countries that you might have come up against and some of that, I suppose, in that political will. Is there something you could say about how to approach that and how to approach maybe, encouraging that political will and whether that's different in different places? Something about that.
Do you want me to go first, Georgina, or do you want to take that first?
I think you're good for that one, Chris.
Oh, I wonder if she froze. Okay. I think that's a really important question. And remember from I spoke about political will being one of the most important aspects. And advocacy for us is part of programming and communication. So first of all, it is really important that we're telling the story clearly You know, we talked about it not being easy. We talked about listening to lived experience voices. And we also talked about demonstrating the evidence, the data. So to answer your question, the best way to go around advocacy is to talk about where it has worked and to show where it has worked. With the Ugandan context, it was very hard for us to talk about it without taking people to Rwanda. But every country is different. And Rwanda is not Uganda, Tanzania is not Uganda, Kenya is not Tanzania, so on and so forth. Malawi, Egypt, Ghana, Nigeria are not those countries. And neither are countries beyond the African continent. But understanding that this practice is possible is the first step. So actually, Remy, for us, it was Rwanda and Romania. Romania in Europe, you know, oh my goodness, wow, they're doing this and they're still doing it. Well, what can we learn from them? And then it was small scale pilots. I want to encourage that, but also learning from others, those who are running educational programs. There's a fantastic organization in Uganda called Nyaka. They build schools and support grandmothers to support children whose parents have passed on from HIV. Learning about that approach was so interesting. We're trying to promote the alternative care that Georgina's talking about. Well, how about using those? So to summarize that, small pilots, demonstrating and sharing good practice that other people are doing. It might not be in the context of the work, but it might be in relation to it. And then the third one is lived experience. Getting young people, young adults who have lived this to tell their story in a very positive and healthy way, only when they're ready to, is important. The other aspect we've got is parenting groups. Those parents will also be able to tell their stories. So political will is key, and you do it through advocacy, and you do it through the community and practice that exists.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chris. You've probably seen Georgina. There's a couple of questions. Were you going to chip in?
Yeah, I was just going to answer Amy's asked the question. She's asked, what training do you offer community members before they are approved as foster carers? Do they receive any funding, food benefits as a foster carer? So I'm happy to answer that for Pomojileo and for our Tanzanian context. So the training provided, and I think it sort of speaks a little bit to what you were saying, Amy, is every country has its own laws around what training is needed. So in Tanzania, the training has to be provided by the district social welfare or the regional social welfare office, and there is a standard training. However, within the legislation, it allows for NGOs to supplement the training. And so what we did was we facilitated the support for the government to do the trainings. And then our social work team did supplemental training, just some additional sort of specialist training on things like specifically infant care, and then specifically working with children who've experienced sexual violence. So being a foster carer for children who've experienced sexual violence. So we did 2 additional bolt-on trainings, whereas, however, the standard training is a government standardized training that all foster carers must go through. And in our district, we've worked in a collaborative approach, so we still provide social work manpower and we work in collaboration with the government, so we support them with the foster care program. So we do a lot of the assessments and follow-up and things of that nature. However, it's all signed off by a government social worker. In terms of, food or financial benefits, so that was part of our learning. When we first started, I had some really great conversations with an organization in Malawi, Sudan, Uganda, and Rwanda. And all of them shared with me, one of them shared a very big mistake they'd made. They had programming in Europe and they'd come over to do some programming in East Africa, and they had taken the professionalized paid foster care model with them, and it didn't work very well. And because what they discovered was the cultural context of family and caregiving just was so different that the paid foster care model didn't really fit within the context. And so, having spoken to a range of other organizations, and also within the legislation here, the government does not pay foster carers. There is no financial benefit to being a foster carer in Tanzania. I know on reflection, the same are true in Uganda, and in other countries. However, what we do recognize is that some families have additional needs. So what we do is we provide support services. And so our list includes the government, and this was the local government authorities provide educational and health waivers. And this is something we advocated for. And it was possible within the legislation. It was a possibility, it wasn't a guarantee. And so we sat down with the regional and district authorities, and they now write health waivers and education waivers for children who are residing with foster families. So that's on the government side, that's what they provide is waivers. What we provide as an NGO is every child gets what we call a comfort kit. So it's a backpack full of, like, you know, the initial needs to prevent financial shock for the family. So it's got your first soaps and clothes and little things that a kid's going to need when they first move in. What they don't have, we have what we call our foster care cupboard. And so when we have a new case, we go into the cupboard and kind of pack a backpack, and that goes along with the child. That's just to reduce the kind of initial financial, like, that might come along with having a new child join the family, specifically because what a lot of the care we do is emergency foster care. The second thing we as an organisation provide is the free daycare spaces to foster families, although that is offered to kinship carers as well. So families that need to continue work, we will make sure that they can get a free daycare space so that they can continue working. And then lastly is formula milk. Again, if somebody takes an infant, we provide free formula milk to any infant that does not have a lactating mother. And so that is also offered to foster families. And not all take it. Some families are financially capable of taking on the full responsibility, but we don't provide any ongoing financial assistance. So families do take up the responsibility of providing for food and those kinds of everyday needs. And one of the key things I will say there is the key to this was being very clear and very upfront. Expectation management, day one of the training, this is what it is. This is a voluntary community service. And one of the powerful stories we got when we did this initial sensitization around what is foster care, before we even found foster carers, people standing up and saying, someone did that for me when I was younger. We didn't call it foster care, but I've always had it in my mind. And in Tanzania, they actually have their own word for foster care. It's called fit persons. And it's a fit person is a person that's fit to care. And they are approved at both the community level and the district level. So it's quite a unique way of operating. So I think it depends on where you come from, which area you're working in. But one of the key things I say around that is I didn't think it was an expectation of families. What we discovered was it wasn't like, I can only do this if. Some people had the question, but expectation management with it. And we found that it's created, you know, the children become part of that family, part of that community. Yeah, it wasn't a huge barrier. You know, we had that worry, I think, at first. But what we did was really trusted the process, and most families, they continue. And those that couldn't afford to keep the children without financial compensations, some of them weren't able to do that. And what we also did in that case was offer other ways that you can support, you know, offer other ways that they could be maybe not a foster family, but support in other ways. Chris, I don't know if you have an answer.
Yeah, look, I think you've said most of it. I'll try and talk very quickly about the differing bits, but most of it is the same. One of the things that we're doing in Uganda is we are recognizing that the concept of foster care is obviously different, and Georgina's talked about that. She's mentioned fit families. So one of the things we learned very quickly is going into communities and using that word. That word is a legal term used mostly in the Western world to explain temporary care for children. So it's community care in Uganda, it's kinship care, it's fit families. And interestingly, in Uganda, fit families were used in the context of probation. Probation meaning children that were in trouble with the law. So we wanted to remove that stigma and make sure that people understood it. So in Uganda, we do have, first of all, informal foster care, which is recognized by local government and signed off by local government. And that's where a family informally takes in a child. There isn't a whole process and paperwork and the training that you're talking about. However, in curbing that and ensuring that there was a standardized approach, we urged the government to document some of our work and other charities, and they came up with national guidelines and standard operating procedures for foster care in Uganda. They're still in draft, but they exist. In that document is the training process. And the training process you ask about is quite lengthy and really good, but we did find that some parents were complaining about that, so we've had to restructure it. In Uganda, it's done with the local government and the local authority. And we even have district alternative care panels. And these are the mechanisms or the structures that approve everybody who can foster. Also in Uganda, the probation and social welfare officer, who is also the government social worker Georgina refers to, can approve emergency foster parents in situations where we need to provide immediate or very quick and short-term support for family. The reason we have foster care in Uganda is to replace the bed in the orphanage. So the more foster carers you have, the less need for an orphanage you have, the more family alternatives you have for those children who need it. The other bit is short-term foster care. At Child's Eye, I'm doing my best with the team to remove short-term and long-term foster care. Short-term is the bridge to family reintegration, and really that is mostly our emergency. And then the long-term, or even sometimes we have fostering to adopt. The long-term is where children know their family, but are not able to go back to the family, but have a relationship. So we maintain that connection, but they grow up in this family and are supported by them instead of an institution. And then fostering to adopt. In Uganda, our adoption law has a provision for you to foster for a period of time and be approved, assessed, visited, the bonding to take place before you can be allowed to adopt a child. Ugandan parents, that's what we do. Like Georgina said, there's some provisions. Really quickly, we use something called the active family support, and the active family support has 5 well-being domains we look at. We use that for prevention, we use that for reintegrating children, and we use it for foster care. So what's provided to the foster care is support around living conditions, family and social relationships. They'll get the same support we provide, education for their child that they're placing or their children, physical and mental health, and household economic support. So if their income and the economy is low, we will support that to ensure they meet the requirements and standard. And as Georgina said, it is key for us as social organizations to advocate that when children are placed in these temporary or even semi-permanent placements, that we ask the government to recognize those placements, to give those people, discounts for education, support with some funding. So our big policy in the standard operating procedures is to ask that the government recognizes in the Children Act, in the Children Act, that these are important people of the community that need to be supported. But we do not pay foster families. Hope that was useful.
Thanks both. We've got one more question. I'm just in the chat. I'm just going to launch this little poll for people that are still hanging around, because we have a few questions for the funder monitoring. So maybe while that's sat there, there's a question from Edward, which is a very interesting one. How do you handle orphanages that do not want to change their ways? I bet either of you could comment on that. Was one of you more keen?
I mean, do you want to go first, Chris? Or shall I?
No, you go first, and I'll just add to that.
I think the core is to find out why, and I think it's in the why, and it's in understanding that often everybody has a reason for why they're resistant or to change, because change is scary. Change can feel threatening. Change can be, I don't know, I don't have the skills to do this. This change can be, it doesn't make sense to me. Change can be, this is, for whatever it is, I think recognizing that change is a process and change can feel scary and threatening is kind of the starting point. And so from my perspective, handling it is around an inquiry. an inquiry as to, you know, well, what's going on for that person. They might have knowledge about, you know, a need or a risk or a threat or something in their context that is, you know, needs to be handled or and addressed. So I think that would be kind of my starting point, is to see, and then once you understand each other's why, then you can start a dialogue in, you know, addressing fears, and looking at kind of, yeah, some of that resistance, and see then what happens. So that would be one of the things. I think there is always, and maybe this is the site, there's always going to be some organizations, and I think in this sector that, you know, this has been the way they've done things for a very long time. And so I think resistance is a normal part of that process. And so I think going in with that expectation, and a collaborative approach to understand everyone starts somewhere. Everybody has their you know, their place on their journey, and everybody is coming at it, you know, often from a place of, this is where I am with the knowledge I have, this doesn't make sense. And so trying to meet people where they are and see it as that we've all got, ultimately, hopefully, we've all got the same goal at heart. And when we do all have the same goal at heart, being the care, protection and well-being of children and their families, I think there's always room for dialogue and conversation, and to find, you know, better ways to look, you know, working together. So that's what I would say around that. I don't know if that was too wishy-washy.
No, thanks. I'll just add to that really quickly. We have the benefit, to be honest with you, Edward, of talking about our own experience of transition. So your question is, how do you handle orphanages that do not want to change? Often when we talk about our story of change, and that's why we documented it, and tell them how hard it was. I mean, we had to go to our board and convince them. We had to work with the team, the organization. Some of us staff were resisting internally because we were worried about our jobs and what was going to happen. And remember, I told you, leave no one behind. That principle is so important when you're talking to people about change, about repurposing their model. We stopped talking about closing. We started to talk about repurposing. We started to talk about the future that exists, the retraining and the support, the diversification. So it's really important that, as Georgina said, you're listening to their story. How did they come about? Why did they come about? There was a reason they were there. They didn't just come because this is what they wanted. Maybe that's the model that was appropriate for the time. So really taking them on that journey is key. So once you read our story, you'll see the resistance that happened internally, and then the transition planning that happened, and then the final transition. We're documenting the other two in Toro, and the three and the two in Mpigi, and the one in Mackinjay. They're all different stories, but there was resistance. We even had resistance actually from care leavers who didn't want to leave. They said, this is our home. We will inherit this land. And that is actually something that really inspired us to think differently, because we realized that that kind of planning hasn't been done. So a really important thing really is to share stories of others that have transitioned. Good news is that BCN, Better Care Network, is documenting more of those. And there's the link that Georgina's put in there that you'll see. The other bit is learn from the experience of those that you're trying to transition, leave no one behind, and reassure the repurposing angle. There can be a future of the orphanage transitioning into a community hub. For example, training, vocational skills, which has happened with some of the ones we've transitioned. In Rwanda, supporting children with disabilities in the community, a health, educational facility, so on and so forth.
Thanks, Chris. What a fascinating session. I think we've come to the end of questions. I see we had someone join a bit last minute who couldn't make the main bit. We're doing a bit of Q&A, so if there's anything else to pop in the chat. But Georgina and Chris have very kindly put their email addresses on the slides, which everyone's going to get. So if there's anything else that comes up, people can always follow up there. Were there any last sort of parting shots, Georgina and Chris, that you wanted to add in, or I think we've covered some really good ground?
Just, I think, please do reach out. Like, my email's on there, Chris's email is on there. We are very happy to be contacted. yeah, and I think just making sure that people realize that is a genuine offer. Please do contact and reach out with questions to network. We'd love to hear what you're up to. So yeah, please do reach out. That would be my parting words.
No, I echo that. I completely echo that. And just, you know, if there's a few takeaways from here today, it's, you know, Georgina has very carefully in our planning thought about how people align themselves with international policy through UN. And then also just let's really go back to our teams and ask the question, you know, what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve for children, long-term outcomes? And what does that look like for them in their new families in the future? So I just want to thank you all for listening and just being here. But yes, Georgina's right. We're here, whatever you need. And thank you very much. And thank you to FSI.
Yes, I was just going to bring up, do check out the FSI for other training and stuff. Thank you, Chris. It was very nice transition there. And we've got some thank yous in the chat. And yes, many thanks everyone for taking part. We'll share, this sounds like there's some great documents of links and things that Georgina and Christopher put together. So that will come out to your email address along with a recording if anyone wants to remind themselves or catch up, or if they've got colleagues who might be interested. And Georgina said very appropriately that there's some stuff some light touch content which you can share with boards, and some people don't have to watch the whole thing to maybe have a bit of info from this session. Thanks everyone. Do check out the FSI. Many thanks to Georgina and Christopher. That was brilliant. That was so interesting. We're really grateful at the FSI for you putting on this session. And yes, much appreciated. Have good rest of your days, everyone. Oh, hello. Oh, nice to see some waves. Thanks everyone. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone.